Our next presenter is Scott Murray. Scott is a British Triathlon Level 3 coach. He's one of 7 coaches to have undergone British Triathlon Kazan program aimed at high-performance coach development. He was involved with the very first GB Para-Triathlon squad in 2008 and has remained working within the GB Para-Triathlon setup. In 2012, as well as being the lead technical strength and conditioning coach for the GB squad, he was also one of GB Para-Triathlon Regional Talent ID coaches. Scott continues to work with GB Para-Triathlon as one of the coaches working with the 2020 development squad. In December 2011, Scott joined the Para-Triathlon Classification Research Group and as the coach representative. But given his academic background, he's been roped into much of our research, and in June 2014, he qualified as a Para-Triathlon technical classifier. So I hand you over to Scott now. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's great to see so many people interested in Para-Triathlon classification. And this afternoon, I want to discuss where we are, how we got here, and hopefully where we're heading to. And before we start, I obviously want to thank the Science and Triathlon Committee for inviting Eric Angstad and myself to do the presentation. Unfortunately, Eric can't be here, but I want to try to keep him involved as much as I can. So at the end, if there's any questions, I'll refer you to Eric. It's a privilege to actually present our work and actually share with you what the Para-Triathlon Research Committee has done so far. This has enabled athletes to go to Rio, and we've heard how important that is for Yannick and hopefully beyond. So I just want to run through quickly where Para-Triathlon classification was. As Inigo said, 1996, the athletes competed. They competed within the age group waves. Big sea change in 2005, because in 2005 at Honolulu, the athletes got a dedicated wave. Jeremy Suter and Paula Craig were the first athletes to do that race, and were sort of trailblazers from that perspective. 2007, we changed what had been the athletes with a disability, and we brought them together into what was Tri 1 to Tri 6. Tri 1 sport class being the athletes that used handbikes and wheelchairs, Tri 6 being the athletes that were visually impaired and used tandems. And we had 4 ambulant classes at that stage. Big sea change in 2008, the ITU got a Para-Triathlon committee together, and about the same time we used a profile-based classification system. The profile-based classification system effectively classified athletes by their condition and their disability rather than their functionality and their ability. And with lots of changes as we headed towards the back of the bid and how we're heading towards Rio. On 11th of December, a great day, the guys got confirmed that they were going to be getting a chance to play on the biggest stage. That came with some checks and challenges, as I'll talk about. And obviously, last year we introduced the new classification system, the PT1 to PT5. PT1 is the handbike and wheelchair athletes. PT5 is the visually impaired. And it was a challenge. We'd got into the games, that's fantastic, but the IPC wanted us to change certain things about our classification process. We had to become compliant. That meant we had to change our classification process. It also meant we had to change our sports classes. We had 12 sport classes across the male and female field, and we had to reduce that. We had to define what conditions and impairments within the sport would be eligible. So, for example, para-triathlon doesn't classify for intellectual disability. And we had to define what level of impairment would be acceptable within para-triathlon. The IPC had let us play. There wasn't a great deal of guidance as to what an evidence-based classification system was and how we were going to get there. We knew that we had to consider the athlete's functionality. We knew that we had to look at aspects of sport-specific testing. There had to be some novel testing in there, and that was all done alongside a medical classification process. So it was a big transition period for everyone concerned within the sport at that time. How were we going to facilitate this? 2011 saw a lot of changes within the ITU, and there was a dedicated funding made available, and a dedicated team came on board. In December 2011, expressions of interest were sought for persons that want to be involved within the Paratriathlon Classification Research Group. And this is where we are now. So we have Eric, who's the ITU liaison. Grant Darby heads up the ITU Paratriathlon Committee. John Besson sits on there as a committee member as well. Marguerite Christophers is our head of classification. Katerina Majuk is a very experienced international classifier. Javier Gramage is a professor in Valencia who specializes in neurological disorders. Up until recently, we had another researcher who was a professor of physiology within the group, and I came on board as the coach representative. The great thing about the group is there's a lot of experience in there. There's a number of coaches, technical and medical classifiers, academics, and I think the main thing is the passion. We're all really passionate about giving the guys a fair chance when it gets to race day. But we had to change a lot of things. And the changes were probably about as straightforward as that wavy promenade in Copacabana Beach. We're to review a whole load of things to make sure that we didn't threaten the athletes as they headed towards Rio. So we reached out to some of the single discipline sports, swimming, paracycling, para-athletics. We know from research that what you see in one single discipline sport doesn't always translate across to triathlon. And the sports we reached out to, none of the sports had an evidence-based classification system in place. You've heard from what Inigo was saying, there's not a great deal of research out there around paratriathlon. To date, the group, as part of the literature review, which is ongoing, we've read over 600 journal articles looking at parasports, triathlon, and classification. If you do have a play looking for paratriathlon-specific research, you will find some nutritional information. Liz Broad published a chapter in a book back in 2014. Vicky Tolfrey's group from Loughborough have recently published a work on nutritional supplementation with paratriathletes, and we saw Inigo's single athlete case study who's doing long distance as was picked up. If you look for evidence-based research for classification, in 2011, Sean Tweedy and his group published one paper that's become a keynote text, and that was looking at manual muscle testing across parasport classification. Recently, seven-a-side football and wheelchair basketball have published their classification methodology, but when we started this back in February 2012, there had been nothing published. We have got good lines of communication with the IPC, and they did appreciate the difficulty we found ourselves in. And they said, well, where you are just now, if need be, you've got to use your observational experience. So we've done a lot of reaching out to national federations and to athletes to try to make it as fair as we possibly can. And we have that continual feedback loop going on. We knew as part of the classification process that we had to change the number of sport classes we had. But we also know from the IPC that you cannot mix sport equipment. So we couldn't have a handbike athlete in the same sports class as a wheelchair, as an ambulance cyclist, or in the same sports class as a visually impaired athlete riding a tandem. We knew that there was a major piece of work still ongoing with the IPC, looking at sport-specific classification in respect of visually impaired athletes, and we hope that will feed forward into what we are doing with the PT5 group. We couldn't do a great deal, given the time frame we had, in respect of making the PT1 classification fairer, so we had to focus on the ambulant athletes, and we had to take 4 sports classes and try to refine them. and we had 18 months to do that in. Sample size, we saw 68 athletes on a regular basis over a 2-year period. We had used up to 100 athletes, but dependent upon how often we saw them and what assessment they'd gone through, it was sometimes we left them out because they were outliers. What became key and very evident was the work that Tweedy had done in 2011 became one of our cornerstones. And when we looked at correlations, manual muscle testing and the athlete's time in competition had a pretty good correlation. It was an R value of 0.7. Any assessment that we tried that came in below a 0.5 correlation, we discarded and rejected. We also had to look at the key movements within swim, bike, and run and come up with some way of weighting them within the classification system. So we looked at athlete time in competition. And for para-triathlon in the ambulance classes, we're coming up with the swim equates to approximately 16% of the race, the bike is 53%, and the run's 29%. So we've checked and challenged, and it was really time to give it a try. And we came up with 3 hypotheses that we wanted to challenge and check. Excuse me. The proposed classification scorecard that we'd come up with, we believe did define key movements in swim, bike, and run. They were factored according to their importance within that segment of the sport, and were weighted according to the percentage time in competition. And that was done alongside the manual muscle testing criteria set out in Daniel's and Worthingham's manual. The novel test that we had and the sport-specific test, we believe, showed the athlete's functional ability in respects of swim, bike, and run, and a little bit in transition, but transition is still quite a problem area for us. Please bear in mind it is a work in progress. That is my back garden, or was my back garden. What we're doing, we know it's better than it was, and that's a driver. And we're setting the foundations in place, cheesy link, to build as we get into Rio and post-Rio. We looked at the key movements across swim, bike, and run for the ambulant athletes, and we tried to work out a degree of importance across those. We looked at functional and biomechanical aspects of that, and we sent that out to national federations for their consideration and feedback as well. So, for example, if you look at the foot up on the graph there, you can see it here. We've got the foot dorsiflexion. In swimming, we would say that dorsiflexion isn't a key movement within swimming, so we score that a 0. If you look at running, we score it a 3 because we feel that in running, ankle dorsiflexion is obviously much more important. A lot of novel tests we came up with, and you can see that they're quite heavily swim defined. The first 5 questions relate to swimming, and that was the practicalities we were faced with. It would be great. I love data. You speak to any of the guys in the audience, they will tell you I'm a data freak. I would love to have facilities that are a swim ergo, a bike ergo, a pool where we could do a wet test, a nice controlled area where we could run athletes around a 180-degree turn. But that never happened. For those that have been through classification, normally it's a small room stuck somewhere down a far corridor. So the practicalities were that we had to try to make it a questionnaire. And that's a problem. It's a problem because it's very subjective, and it's also a problem because you speak to an athlete and take an athlete through these questions. They would come in as part of the novel data collection and the pilot study, and they would want to please. Athletes are honest and they want to please. So you would say to an athlete, can you do this movement? Can you do that movement? And they would say, yes, I can. They've usually come in with a coach because the coach wants to find out what this classification system is all about, that we're moving towards the games. And you've got an athlete in front of a coach, and again, the athlete wants to please the coach. So they will say, yes, I can do all that. And they were actually putting themselves at a disadvantage. Because if you answer all these questions, yes, we're going to say that you're far more functional and we're going to put you in a far more competitive sports class. We did have checks and balances. This was run in conjunction with the manual muscle test, and obviously we could see the athlete in competition to see if what they were self-reporting actually matched what we're seeing within the field of play. One of the novel tests we looked at was a counter movement jump. Really, that came in to assess coordination and balance, and it was that aspect of practicality and facilities. A relatively simple test you can do with no equipment in a very small contained area. It does give, there is some science out there to show, obviously, that it does give an indication of balance and coordination. And it's one of those tests that was novel because there's very few athletes do counter movement jumps as part of their day-to-day training regime. And we came up with a scorecard in the end. So you can see, you can see that this area here, all the grey area, is the medical assessment. The medical assessment is done as the main driver and makes up approximately 67% of the athlete's classification process. The questionnaire, or the functional athlete profile as it became known, makes up the rest. And I say that's weighted against and try to be driven by the athlete's ability and functionality rather than the condition. For the neurological athletes, we appreciated the fact that we had to do a bit more work with the neurological athletes. That hasn't come out very well, I don't think, on your screens. This is basically a list of established clinical tests, and that's to establish whether the athlete has hypertonia, which is too much muscle tone, making the muscles stiff and the limbs stiff. Athetosis, which is like a slow, involuntary muscle spasm, or ataxia, which is a lack of voluntary contraction of the muscle, usually affects the athlete's coordination, balance, and speech. The neurological athletes go through this. It adds richness to the classification process. It doesn't carry any weight towards the point score that the athlete has at this time. And this is what we got. So it's data collected over an 18-month period, seasons 2012-2013. The data was collected at World Championship, Continental Championships, key para-triathlon events, and national camps in different countries. It's a data set of 68 athletes, and it was the biggest sample size that we could get given the time frame and the fact the athletes were volunteers. You can see that it's difficult to see too many obvious breakpoints within that data set. You've almost got a line of best fit between impairment, functionality, and time in competition. Remember, we had 4 ambulant classes, and 4 was too many, so we had to change that into less than 4 ambulant classes. And it got to the stage we could no longer go around the maze. We had to go straight to the cheese. The process had to be in place for 2014 because in 2014 we had to reclassify athletes, and we had to make sure it was in place so that coming into the qualification period, the athletes knew who they were going to be racing within that qualification period. Inigo and Yanni spoke about it. So the new classes are PT2, 3, and 4. PT2 are the athletes that have less functionality and higher impairment levels. PT4, or as it's commonly known within para-triathlon, the group of death, is for those higher functioning athletes. If you were to score 557 points, it means that you're not eligible to compete in para-triathlon at a major medal event. You can still do open events, you just cannot compete at a major medal event. And the process is continuing. We're continually in that feedback loop. I won't go around all the boxes, I'll talk across them. Up until 2013, there was a very small group of classifiers. There's been a number of classifiers courses since then. We also had to rewrite the classification manual from scratch to encompass the new methodology and to make sure we're talking about the new sports classes. And that was done. There was some stunning work done by a group of volunteers. What we weren't so good at was communicating the changes to the classifiers. We were a little bit slow in getting that information out there to the classifiers who were doing that. We saw the athletes and the national federations on race sites over 2 seasons, and we got some great buy-in. You know, the athletes were really inquisitive about what was happening. There was a lot of questions from them. They were very supportive. They've given us feedback when we've asked for it. National federations themselves were obviously very keen to find out what was happening with regards to sports classes, because that may affect their funding bid. And we had some fantastic dialogue with the athletes in the national federations in the field of play. But again, perhaps what we weren't so good at was talking to these guys for the months on end in the closed season. The evidence-based aspect is still a work in progress. It's still very difficult. It'd be great to have all the toys to get wattage and objective measures. We are getting better facilities now. LOCs, we have had a change of mindset, and we're getting to the stage now where this year almost every classification panel has had access to swimming pools or treadmills to assess the athletes, doing some of the functional tests. There's some exciting stuff happening. The ITU have been very supportive and have invested a lot of money into a project that Javier is running in Valencia, looking at accelerometers and how we can use that data alongside manual muscle testing in the ambulant classes. We know the IPC are doing that massive piece of work, as I mentioned, so we look forward to seeing that feeding into the PT5 aspect. But it's difficult. You know, we heard from Inigo, a lot of the athletes that were with his athletes class have left the sport, and that's never a good thing. But it's rare to see two athletes present with the exact same condition. And for example, in London 2012 at the Summer Games, 20 sports were contested. Across those 20 sports, there were 110 sport classes. So you can see the difficulty it is with regards to trying to have athletes in the correct sport class when you have so many sport classes across so many sports. And I think one of the key messages is the fact we know it's not perfect. We're continually in that feedback loop, as I spoke about. We know it's better than it was. We're getting good processes in place, and I think you can see that from the support the IPC has given us, because we're one of the first sports to be confirmed for Tokyo 2020. So when you take it into consideration, you know, we are moving in the right direction, although maybe not as quick as some of the athletes would want. So horizon scanning. That is the marine park in Tokyo. That's one of the photographs from the marine park where the games will be held in 2020 for the athletes. It looks like America, but I'm assured it's not. It's just some stuff they had out there for earlier on this year. And these are things we've got to do. As I say, when we're away from the athletes in the field of play, we need to make sure that we keep that communication running with them and running a bit better. We need to get the buy-in from our shareholders and stakeholders. You saw the transition slide after we got into the games in December 2010, and that was almost T1. And after Rio, we're going to be heading towards T2 because we know that the ambulant classes will be getting tweaked. We know we've actually got time to spend a lot of time looking at the PT1 sport class to make it fairer for the handbike wheelchair athletes. And we anticipate that the IPC will give us some information to work on as we head towards Tokyo. Keep smiling. You know, it isn't really a hard, arduous task when you think of the fact that we're all here because we're keen to give the athletes a fair playing field and give them the best opportunities we possibly can. And that's what it's about. The next time the athletes are in that blue carpet, it's the Summer Games. So how good is that going to be? If you remember, I said at the end that I wanted to keep Eric involved. So if you had any questions, I'd get you to ask Eric. I know he's not here, so I'm trying to have a cop-out on this. Thank you for listening about the classification. That's all from me. Any questions?